Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. Not too long ago, I compared the original NES release of Mega Man with the Genesis version included in Mega Man The Wily Wars. And let me tell you a little secret. There's more than one Mega Man game. Shocking, I know. So I figured today let's take a look at Mega Man 2. We'll be looking at both the original NES release again, compared to the version contained within the Genesis compilation game, Mega Man The Wily Wars. Here's a look at the specs of the two systems, while I tell you just a smidge about the game itself. The original Mega Man 2, known as Rockman 2 in Japan, was released at the very end of 1988. It's regarded by many as their favorite game in the original NES series of the first 6 Mega Man games. And for good reason. It's great, and I think it's my personal favorite of the original 6 games as well. Now, the US release of this game featured a difficulty option with a normal and a hard difficulty, and personally I think this game plays best on the normal or easy difficulty level. Capcom released Mega Man The Wily Wars, or Rockman The Wily Wars, at the tail end of 1994, and it only saw physical releases in Japan and Europe. In the US, we were limited to playing this game via the Sega Channel. However, many years later, the game was included on Sega's release of the Sega Genesis Mini, and that's the version that you'll be seeing here today. I'm not actually playing this on a Genesis Mini, because I wanted to play it without any of the input or sound lag on that system's included emulator. And yes, you can hack the Genesis Mini to use other emulators, and I did in fact do that to mine, but I wanted to have a level playing field here. Now, the Genesis Mini version of Mega Man The Wily Wars, and even the original release, did not include the Easy mode from Mega Man 2 on the NES. So I had to play the NES version on hard mode so it could be equivalent to the Genesis version for this video. Alright, so recording methodology for this one. I played both games straight through, but I did use save states in order to help sync them up as closely as possible. Aside from that, there were one or two segments where I cut out a little bit of dead screen time in one version or the other, but when I say a few incidents, I mean like 2, maybe 3 throughout the entire game. Alright then, let's get on with it. Here we are, NES versus Genesis Mega Man 2. We can see that the enemy select screen uses different colors in each version, and we get a fancier star field on the Genesis version when you actually have the enemy introduced. For Metal Man's stage here, it actually doesn't look a ton different. The biggest difference comes in the form of the treadmills, which actually look kind of like treadmills on Genesis, and just weird sci-fi tech thingies on the NES port. We can see there's a lot more flicker on the NES version, especially in this area. And that will be true throughout the entire game. But one thing that's also true is that the Genesis version has a lot of slowdown that's not present in the NES version. And here's an example of a big problem with the Genesis game. On the NES Mega Man 2, when you fire your shots, if one of your shots hits something, you can fire again immediately. On the Genesis, it maintains a timer, so even if your shot hits something immediately, you've got to wait like a second before you can fire another one. And that really hampers the gameplay. I'll also note that on Genesis, Mega Man's shots are way slower than in the NES original for some reason. Now we've just heard the music change over. So the music is pretty good in the NES one, and I would say that the Genesis version of this game also has pretty good music. I think a lot of the songs on the Genesis sound better, which is what you would expect from a 16-bit remake. But it's definitely not a slam dunk. There are still a couple that I think are better on the NES original. And while oddly the Genesis version doesn't have any parallax in this area, at least we can see that it is a lot more colorful than the NES game. We've got sort of silver and gold style gears and everything, while on the NES, everything is a more uniform color. You'll also see there's a lot of extra tiles in the Genesis version, giving it a little more detail for its foregrounds and backgrounds. Here's our first enemy robot master, Metal Man, and this fight is quite a bit different in the two versions. The treadmill reverses directions a lot more on the Genesis one than it does on NES. And this also introduces one of the game's biggest problems in the Genesis port, and that is when you hit the one of the robot masters, their invincibility frames are much longer on Genesis than they are on the NES. So you've got to wait quite a bit longer after you hit them once before you can hit them again. And that really kind of messes with the way that the boss fights play out. And because of that, you'll see that many of these fights just tend to take longer on Genesis than they do in the NES original. Don't worry, we're almost there. But this is a perfect example of what I was just talking about. Now, it does usually play a sound effect when the enemies die, but for some reason, it didn't there on Genesis. Don't know why. And you can see we get much fancier little interstitial screens in the Genesis version of the game, and Mega Man has gone from a weird little dumpy thing to something much more sleek and cool looking. Now, on Genesis, we can of course save our game between enemies, or between levels. Next up, I decided to tackle Airman. At first glance, these stages look pretty similar. The cloud animation is a lot faster on NES, but on Genesis we get a lovely layer of parallax scrolling. Also, the big weird robot face enemy things are always visually present on the Genesis, while on the NES they don't show up until you get close to them. And then when you do get close, they just kind of warp into existence. And then we've got a slight actual game design difference coming up here on this little cloud section. I'll point it out, it'll be on the very next one. Now, if you'll see on the NES, this enemy decides to go around and do a big circle, so he ends up behind you, while on Genesis it doesn't. It always stays in front of you. Why did they make that change? Great question. Don't know. So here we've got a much more detailed background on Genesis, and it frankly looks a lot better on that version than it does on the NES. This area also helps to show one major problem with the Genesis version, and its shots being so much slower. Where you have the little bird enemies that drop the eggs, the timing is a lot different because your shots are so much slower in the Genesis game. Makes it a little bit tougher to hit them before they land. And for the music in this stage, it's kind of a toss-up. There are parts I like better about the NES one, and parts I like better about the Genesis one, so I'll call this one a draw. I think you can also already see that there's a little more slowdown in the Genesis one. And the enemies with the fans in their bellies are a little bit more forceful on Genesis than on NES. Here in the room leading up to the boss, the room of transition, we have way more detail on Genesis. And here comes our Airman fight. Ordinarily, you'd want the wood shield to take him down, but I chose to do these levels in this order because of the way that the items are awarded. And once again on Genesis, you've got to be real careful how you time your shots for maximum effect, since the invincibility frames are so much longer on the Robot Masters in that version. Once again, we compare our sleek, cool little anime-style Mega Man to the very dumpy, frumpy little NES version on the interstitial screen. And here's our first look at Dr. Light, who looks a little bit more like he does in the games that came after the NES versions, as you might expect on the Genesis port. And there's item 2, which is the reason I decided to tackle Airman Stage when I did. Next up, we've got Crashman. I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but on Genesis, once more, we see a lovely parallax layer and more detailed tiles in the foreground. Another thing you'll notice here on the Genesis one is that the vertical scrolling, once you reach either the top or bottom of the screen, is much faster. In the original NES game, the screen basically pauses for like a full second before it scrolls either up or down, while on Genesis it's almost instantaneous. Now we have our lovely platform riding section in both games. Some handy advice here, if you haven't played it, is it can be good to take on Woodman Stage first, because the wood shield is a handy weapon to have on these. It surrounds you, and the enemies will just fly into it, and you won't take any damage or get knocked off the platform. I didn't do that here. Again, I feel like the two versions look pretty different here. And now we'll have an oddity. We have an area where the NES actually has a little more going on in its foreground with that cloud, and it's just not there on Genesis for some reason. Yet, as soon as we go up a screen, we've got some extra detail on the Genesis one that's not present on the NES. One other thing that I hadn't pointed out yet is that Mega Man is also a little bit taller on the Genesis version than the NES version. This can also lead to some issues when jumping and you have a platform like directly above your head. It can be a little bit tougher to wiggle your way around. Musically, as far as things go for this stage, I think this is one where I actually do prefer the Genesis song. And there's another little oddity I could point out. When you use item 2, on the Genesis, if you fire it to the left, the 2 is facing in the correct direction, while on NES, it's reversed. Meanwhile, on NES, if you fire item 2 to the right, it's facing the correct direction, and on Genesis, the 2 is reversed. Here on Genesis, we get some extra fencing to add a little bit of character to the backgrounds. And here, the tornado weapon can hit Crashman multiple times in one shot on NES, but not on the Genesis. So on the NES, you can actually take him out much quicker if you're careful with that shot than you can in the Genesis version. And you may just see me do that a little bit later, when the Robot Masters make their encore appearance towards the end of the game. My fourth Robot Master, I've decided to take on Bubble Man. And here's a stage that looks pretty different between the two games. The layout is of course the same, but on the NES we just get a nice little animated waterfall in the background. On Genesis we get sort of a semi-transparent, at least with a mesh transparency waterfall, that's actually got stuff behind it. And here's something I'll point out that's a difference in the difficulty levels. For these enemies with the shells, if you're playing on the normal difficulty, which is really easy in the NES game, they just explode when you shoot them. On the hard level, which is the only level on Genesis, when you shoot those enemies, their shells pop off and a little bit of the enemy is left on the bottom. Then as we get to this section in the water, we've got a nice little wavy line scrolling effect on Genesis, and we've got absolutely nothing in the background on NES. Oh no, Mega Man, watch out for those Metroids! And yeah, I know they're not Metroids. So with the giant fish enemy here, I've decided to just go through it instead of taking the time to kill it. It's better if you take a hit from the small enemies because it does less damage, and then you go through him while you're, enjoying your invincibility frames. And I did that for both instances of that large fish enemy. Here, Mega Man has to avoid a bad case of crabs. Once more on the little transition screen from the level to the boss, we've got much more detail on Genesis. For the boss fight itself, it's pretty similar on both. He's weak against Metal Man's weapon, so that's what I used in both versions here. And yeah, that's the end of Bubble Man. Until it isn't, since we will see him again later. I've already commented on that screen a couple of times, so I won't anymore. And we're halfway through the Robot Masters now. So here comes number 5 of 8, Heat Man. And just like with Mega Man, the Robot Masters are a little larger on Genesis than they are in the NES originals. It's not a huge difference, but it's a difference. And here on the Genesis, we've got a little bit more detail in the background again, and in the foreground as well, really. You can see they've added some tiles with cracks in them, pipes, and other things like that are just not present in the NES original. This is another one where I would give the musical edge to the Genesis version. I like that version of the song better than this NES original. Which I'll switch back over to the Genesis one in a moment or two here. So this part, yeah, not a whole lot to say. It's pretty much the same between the two versions. The difference in the character size can make hitting the top a little bit more of a cumbersome issue on the Genesis than the NES one. As we get into this long straightaway part, you can see more tiles again on the Genesis version. It's got things like lava leaking out of pipes, little monitors or windows showing lava, and things like that. Here you can see the difference in the way Item 2 faces on the Genesis versus the NES version. And here's an enemy that's really not worth taking the time to fight, so I don't. Here comes Heat Man, right after our lovely little interstitial stage. Now, Heat Man is actually a little bit different between the two games timing-wise. On the NES, it's a lot easier to hit him before he has a chance to fire at you after he shoots across the screen. On Genesis, he pretty much fires right away as soon as he stops. As you can see, it doesn't make too much of a difference in how long it takes to defeat him, but you have more of a chance of taking damage on Genesis than NES. Now we're down to just 3 more Robot Masters, and then after that we'll be taking on Wily's Castle, which has several more levels. And we also get Item 1 for finishing this level. Item 1 lets you shoot out a platform that slowly levitates upwards. And you will see me use that quite a few times, especially in the Wily levels. Now we finally take on Woodman. Now for this stage, I like that the NES version is brighter. The Genesis one is a little dark and dingy. It didn't need to be as bright as the NES one, but it just, I don't know, it looks kind of unfinished, especially the parallax layer. They decided to more imply the trees and their leaves than actually show them. And they also sort of changed the wood foreground to dirt on the Genesis, which I guess the dirt makes a little more sense, but it's a difference. And then another big difference between the two versions here is the actual platforms on top of the wood or dirt are actually sort of electronic and glowing on the Genesis. Meanwhile, they're not on the NES one. They're just plain platforms, possibly made of wood since it is Woodman's stage. And then the Genesis also adds some other electronic elements embedded in the dirt throughout the foreground. So you'll see a whole bunch of glowing lights and things like that that are not present in the NES version at all. As far as music for this stage goes, I think this is one where the Genesis easily beats the NES original. So, good job, musicians! Alright, now once we get to this outside area, I do think the Genesis has a clear edge and a much nicer look than the NES version. You also notice on Genesis here we get a lovely 3 layers of scrolling. Technically it's 2, with the background actually split into 2 layers. Now another difference I'll note between these two games here is these rabbit enemies, when they fire carrots, the carrots are way faster on the NES original than they are in the Genesis remake. Now we've got our robot chicken section. And sure, everyone knows the TV show Robot Chicken, but did you know in the Transformers series from the early 80s that they actually used the term Robot Chicken? I bet you didn't. It's in a line of dialogue. Don't believe me? Go watch it on YouTube. The whole series is there, legitimately for free. Now on Woodman here, we see a big difference in that it takes a little bit longer to charge up your heat shot, and there's a ton of slowdown when Woodman fires the shield at you on Genesis that is not present on NES. Also, I missed the stupid second heat shot, so this fight is taking longer on Genesis. Don't worry, we're almost there. I just have to switch weapons one more time. And there we are. Alright, moving right along, our next enemy is going to be Flashman. And here's another stage that really looks a lot different between the two versions. On the NES, we've got some simple color cycling on the foreground tiles that you walk on, while on Genesis they just flash every so often like they have a little glint of light they caught. On the NES, we just have a plain tiled background, while on Genesis we get these nice see-through crystals in the foreground, and then also a weird little honeycomb crystalline pattern in the background. And I will say either crystalline or crystalline, whichever pronunciation you prefer. Now here's a super annoying thing with Crashman's weapon. Once you fire it, it clings to the wall, and then you have to wait for the explosion animation to go off and then finish before you can fire again. That leads to an awful lot of waiting around while you're using that weapon. Now we've got kind of a hilarious blooper coming up. In both versions, I decided to shoot the Crashman grenade at the wall, have it blow up. I was going to jump and get the health, but I missed it in both. And what's funny about that is I played this game a total of 8 times on both platforms before I did this recording, and in each of these games, that was the only time I failed to make that jump. And then once again, we've got the vastly different backgrounds on the 2 versions on display here. It also seems like some of these blocks are a little closer together on Genesis than they are on NES. Anyway, here we go, getting ready to fight our boss, Flashman. He's going to be weak against Metal Man's weapon, which is the real star of this game, since it's strong against 3 separate bosses. And wow, that background is loud on the NES with just bright white assaulting your eyes. This area looks much better on Genesis. And there's Crashman down. We've only got one standard Robot Master left to take out. And aside from getting his weapon, we get our final item here, item 3. This one is sort of a weird, bouncy platform, and I don't remember if I ever even use it in this game. If I do, I'll point it out. There's only one spot I might have. And last on the agenda is Quick Man. And this stage shows off a very primary difference between the 2 games, and that's that vertical scrolling delay that we have in the NES version that is not present in the Genesis version. It leads to me having to pause the Genesis version a lot to let the NES one catch up to it. Now you could use Flashman's weapon to stop time to make this section a little bit easier, but I'm saving power on it for the boss fight, so I decided to just run through without using it here. Once again, we've got a very different color scheme between the 2 versions. It's one of those things where it's really just preference. I can't say one is superior to the other. And now we've got more of these things again. If you go to grab the health right there, you gotta be super quick or it's practically a death sentence. So I decided to just leave it and not mess with it. And I don't know why I decided to stay and fight that enemy on NES. After I took the hit, I decided it wasn't worth it and then just went on anyway. I wasn't doing this as a speedrun or anything like that. It's just I don't like standing around shooting bullet sponge enemies that are not necessary to move on. There, the transition screen before the boss looks way different in both as per usual. Here's Quickman. We make him less quick by using the weapon to stop time on him. That'll drain him down to just roughly about half of his total energy. After that, the best thing to use on him is the Crashman grenades. On the NES version, me and him technically killed each other on the same frame there, but it gave me the win. You can tell that happened though because Mega Man is in the middle of exploding during his little victory pose. I'm not going to complain, it's better than having to redo the fight. And with that, we move on to the Wily stages. Now our little cutscene, or intermission, or whatever you want to call it with Dr. Wily here, for whatever reason is much longer on Genesis than it is on NES. It's not quite twice as long, but it's pretty close to that. As you can see, Wily flew into his castle much faster on NES. And also on Genesis, it didn't even play the music right until we got up to the map area. Okay, so here's our first Wily stage. And yeah, clear win for Genesis here with its better colors and parallax background and extra foreground layer detail. As far as the music goes, once again here I prefer the Genesis game. Also in this area you can see me making use of item 1. Now I could have fought those things instead of just taking damage and running through them, but there's really no point, it just slows you down, so I decided to just go through them. Here you can watch me take out the shield guys the smart way. And get at the very top of the ladder and you can shoot their feet. And if you do that, they shoot over your head, they can't hit you. And you'll get to see me do that again here. And in these vertical screens in this area, we can once again see more detail on the Genesis in the foreground layer. Now this next section coming up is way easier on NES than it is on Genesis. Firing out your item 1s and jumping to the top is a pain in the butt in the Genesis game. It's really hard to grab that ladder. I had to do that a lot of times to get the timing down. On NES, it's really easy. On Genesis, the problem is, since you're a little bit taller, your head hits the ceiling sooner, and it's tougher to get enough distance to grab that ladder. Now here's a part that looks way different between the two games again. We'll have this area with the dragon that comes up from the left. On the NES, we just have a plain black background. On Genesis, we get a detailed foreground and background layer and the dragon. On the NES, the dragon is the background, which is why it looks the way it does. Now on NES, this dragon is way easier to take out. You just blast him with the boomerangs until he's dead. On the Genesis, he likes to wander in a lot more vertical space than he does in the NES version, so you can see him flying up near the top of the screen, but the only way I'd be able to hit him is if I was on the top block here and not the bottom one. But of course, he doesn't always position himself up there, so you're better off staying on the bottom block, because that'll give you more access to hit him from any height. Anyway, he's dead now. Let's move on. Here's our second Wily Stage, which uses the same music from the first Wily Stage. There are some elements of the foreground and background I prefer on the NES version for this area. But still, there is a little bit more going on in the Genesis version with its flashy lights and animated tiles. On the NES, the only thing animated are the fans. Also, note that when you pick up items that refill your health or energy, the refill happens a little faster on Genesis than it does on NES, which you just saw. Now this section is a real pain on the Genesis compared to the NES. On the NES, it's not too tough to take these things out, but because of the firing delays on the Genesis version, it's really hard to kill any of them. It's easier to just run through them and take the damage. And then here's a slight level design difference. At the top of the cliff there, on Genesis you have some space before the thing that comes down and crushes you. On NES you have no space. The crushing claw thing is on the very edge of the platform. It's just strange they made that decision to change that one little thing. Alright, and here is the quote-unquote boss of the area. You really just fight a whole bunch of enemies, and you've got to take them all out while avoiding them as they form together. It's not too tough if you hit them right away. If you give them a chance to move around by missing them or not timing your shots right, then they can be a little bit tough to take out. Occasionally they'll move real fast and just make a beeline straight for you. Alright, we're done on Genesis and done on NES. That's Wily Stage 2 cleared. And guess what comes up next? Here's Wily Stage 3. This one's a little shorter and simpler, thankfully. It does change up the music a bit. And once again, in these vertical sections, the Genesis version scrolls through them a lot faster. And we've got way more detail in the liquid area on Genesis than on NES. We do have the giant fish in both versions, facing a different direction in each. Now, the second fish should be there on NES, and normally is, but on that playthrough, it just didn't jump out of the water. Or the muck, or whatever that stuff is. Now, this vertical area is a lot tougher on Genesis because the vertical scrolling is so much faster. So it's tougher to avoid those spikes. Mega Man also runs a little bit faster through the water on the Genesis than he does on the NES. Now these enemies are a lot easier to take it on NES because of how much faster you can shoot at them. And then on Genesis, there's no door to transition to the boss, you just walk straight through up to it. And this boss is the Guts Tank. So you can see on NES we just get another plain black background, while on Genesis we get a nice full foreground, background, and the enemy. And he's still shockingly easy to take out in both versions. Although they do make sure in the Genesis version that you actually get a chance to see him before you take him down. Alright, Wily Stage 4. I would say musically again, for these stages, the Genesis has the edge in both of them. Sounds a little bit nicer. But the music is still fine in the NES version. And look at this, in the Genesis version, he shoots before you even get a chance to really get on screen. That's a cheap shot. Now for this next section here, we've got some basically false floors or pitfalls. I decide on this one to avoid it just by riding item 2 over to the ladder. We've got another one at the very top left of this ladder area, for the ladder in the upper left corner of the screen. This time, though, I decide to just jump over the one that I know is there. And you've got another pitfall near the energy tank, but you can still get it. I just don't need it there, so I decide not to. Another look at how much different the shot speed is in both versions. And hey, more fun platform riding. You gotta make sure you don't just drop off the ladders, or you will fall into the spikes on these next 2 screens. And I could have used a few items to speed this up, but I wanted to keep my energy for everything I knew I was going to need at some point. Here I'll pull out the wood shield, and you'll see a pretty big difference between the 2 games. On NES, the game still runs at the same speed. It maintains its regular speed. On Genesis, as soon as you bust out that wood shield, the game slows to a crawl. I mean, come on, guys. This was an NES game from 1988. You couldn't get this running full speed on the Genesis in 1994? There's just no excuse for that. This is the final platform area for this part. And then in sort of the reverse case of before, for some reason on the Genesis I decided to stay and fight this enemy here. I don't know why. I should have just ran through it. And that's alright, it doesn't really affect the comparison too much. I still catch up. Alright, and here we go to our most annoying boss fight in the entire game. So you can use either item 1 or item 3 to get to the higher platforms in this area, and then the crash grenades are the thing that you use to take these enemies out most easily. They can also destroy the walls. The problem is, you don't have enough ammo to destroy every enemy and every wall, so you've got to conserve them. And hey, look, on NES, I did use item 3, so you did get to see it one time, just right there. On the Genesis version, it wasn't necessary to do that, so that is the only time in this entire game you get to see item 3. And you can also see during this fight, there's a lot of slowdown again on Genesis that just does not happen in the NES original. Now, I talked about, in my original comparison of Mega Man 1 on both platforms, about the development history of this game, and supposedly, according to what people have written about it, it did have a troubled development, and I can sort of believe that, seeing some of the end results. Overall, it's still good, but just some of the efficiency problems are mind-boggling. Here's our 5th and what appears to be final Wily Stage, but spoiler alert, it's not the last stage, there's one more after this. Here we'll go and fight all those robot masters all over again. I'm just going to start in the upper left and do a semicircle to get to the upper right. Or semicircle if semi bothers you pronunciation-wise. The boss fights will be a little bit different this time around since I do have all the weapons now. Also, all the boss fights here on our second time through happen on plain, flat ground with no obstacles. So the bosses are a little bit easier at this point than they were earlier. So here you can see me use the wood shield against Airman. It's kind of annoying because his tornadoes make the wood shield deflect away if it hits them. And here's Woodman, and this time you can watch me not screw up the atomic fire charge shots. Also, on the Genesis version, there's no slowdown when he fires at you this time like there was the first time we fought him. Why is that? Don't know. Great question. Here's our Bubble Man fight. Once again, he's weak to Metal Man's weapon. You know who else is weak to Metal Man's weapon? Metal Man. And you'll get to see that in just a moment or so. Here's our Quick Man fight, which is a lot easier since we don't have all those stupid platforms to worry about. And visually, there's not a ton of difference here aside from the color changes and the fact that there's a few extra foreground and background elements on Genesis that are not present on NES. Notably the air vents and some panels on the foreground layer. And yeah, I decided to use the good old Buster to just finish him off in both versions here. Next on our agenda is Crashman again. Now on NES, you can see how easy it is to take him out, and those shots can hit him multiple times. On Genesis, that doesn't happen, but I still managed to take him out pretty quick. Here's our Metal Man fight, with Metal Man being weak against his own weapon. And to complete our boss rush area here, we've got Flashman. Also weak against Metal Man's weapon. As you can see on the NES, it's just easy to wreck him right from the beginning without even moving. On Genesis, he's a little less predictable, and his timing's a bit different. Now our first Wily fight. We can see this machine, which looks pretty similar to the one from the end of the first Mega Man. Now on the NES, he's weak to several different weapons. On the Genesis version, he's not, so it's easier to just take him out with the Buster Shot. Because of that, and the NES playthrough, I decided to just use the Buster Shot to keep the two games as similar as possible. Same deal for his second form. On the NES, you can especially use the Atomic Fire fully charged on the normal difficulty level to destroy his first form in one shot right at the beginning. Alright, and there we go. Our second form is taken down on Genesis, and we fall through the floor. And then the same thing happens here on the NES version. And look at that! It added a super secret extra level! Now the easy way to do this is to just hold the controller all the way to the right, or the control pad, so you end up as far to the right as possible when you land on the ground, and then you can just run through this and jump as necessary, and nothing will touch you. If you don't do that, you can actually get hurt by these drop things. But this is like half a level at best, and oddly enough, the foreground elements look kind of like pencils in the Genesis version. And here's our real final boss. Wily jumps out and, oh no, look at that, he's an alien. Now the Genesis boss fight here has a ton of slowdown. Every time you fire your weapon, it slows down for the bubble shots. Or bubble lead, I should say. Now the Starfield background actually looks better and more complicated on NES. There's no reason for that. Why would that be? You can see it's got more stars. The third background layer for the stars, or I should say third star layer on NES, has a lot of stars. On the Genesis, the third star layer literally has one star up near the top of the screen that you can see slowly make its way from left to right, and that's it. It's like, I just don't know how they managed to mess up the look of this final fight so badly. Alright, and there we go. We've finally taken him down, and Mega Man 2 is completed in both versions. The little dome at the top of the screen, on the NES, it starts out pretty much black, and we'll see the reflection flash and build into it. On the Genesis, that flash happens pretty much immediately, and we see the reflection in the dome pretty much right from the start. Now we have our ending, which starts a little bit quicker on the Genesis version. For some reason, we get to watch Mega Man walking through all the seasons. This must be an awfully long walk home. We go from fall to winter. Pretty soon we'll see spring and summer. Now, this ending definitely doesn't make the most sense, but hey, at least we get to look at some nice animation of a large version of Mega Man walking. As you can see, our little potato Mega Man on the NES on the left looks up and to the side quicker than he does on Genesis for some reason. And then after that, we jump into the credits. The credits start with just showing you who designed each of the Robot Master bosses. Now on the NES, we have the scrolling star fields here. On the Genesis, we just have a plain static background. Kind of strange that they made that decision, but, you know, whatever. What's even stranger is that as soon as these credits are done for the designers of the Robot Masters, guess what you get to see on the Genesis side? Scrolling again. And there you go. I don't know why they did that way. So, in the end, Mega Man 2, great game on both platforms. Even though I'm going to tell you which one I think is better once we get back to the video segment right after this, they're both good and they're both worth playing. But one clearly is better than the other, especially when it comes to gameplay. But this is one of those games where I would definitely recommend that anyone experience both of them and then determine which one you like better for yourself. Now, I do have to say there's no excuse, which I've said before and will say again, for the problems with slowdown that we see in the Genesis version. I don't understand how they didn't have that stuff ironed out for a release like this in 1994, especially when we'd seen so many more complicated games released at that point that did not have issues like that. But what can you do? Back to the video. Alright, you've seen both games in their entirety now, so it's time to draw some conclusions. Now, as a quick reminder, for the NES and Genesis versions of the original Mega Man, I didn't think that one really stood head and shoulders above the other, so there was no clear winner as to which was better. I don't really think that's the case for Mega Man 2, however. So to start off with, on the Genesis version, yeah, it looks a lot better than the NES game, and I would say in most cases the music and sound effects are a lot better also. But the one area where it really falters is in the gameplay. The changes that were made to the Genesis version in this case definitely were not for the better. The problem with shot speed is a pretty big one. The shots are so much slower, it really hampers the gameplay, especially if you're used to playing the NES original. Aside from that, the way the game calculates and determines if you're allowed to shoot is just so off in this version, it really hurts the experience. So the best example I can give you of that is when you're right in front of an enemy on the NES version, as I mentioned during the video, you can just fire with no delay between your shots. Every time a shot disappears, you can immediately fire another. On the Genesis, it's got a built-in timer, so even if you're right in front of an enemy, if you fire a shot, you've still got to wait like a second before you can fire another one. And for some of the damage sponge enemies, it makes them very hard to deal with on the Genesis version when they're quite simple on the NES one. And then there's the whole problem of the invincibility frames for the bosses. On the Genesis version, the bosses have extra long invincibility frames, so you've got to wait quite a while between when you hit them and when you can hit them again. On the NES, this isn't the case, and the invincibility frames are way shorter. And then there is, of course, all the extra slowdown that's present in the Genesis version that's not in the NES original. I mean, for a 16-bit game that came out 6 years after the 8-bit original, there's just no excuse for that. There's no excuse. So in the end, the Genesis version of Mega Man 2 definitely has the edge when it comes to graphics and sound. But when it comes to gameplay, the NES version just walks all over it. It's a much better game to play on NES. And I'll also add, this is one game where I think it's just more fun to play on the normal or easy difficulty on NES. And it's a shame that they didn't include that in the Genesis version. Alright, so tell me your opinions on Mega Man 2. Do you like the NES version better? Do you like the Genesis version better? Do you like some other version better? Tell me all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please toss it a like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. And keep in mind that for some reason, if you don't have that notification bell hit, these days there's a good chance YouTube will not tell you when I put a video out. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon or Ko-fi. The links are at the end of the video and also down below in the description. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.